He stepped onto the plane carrying more than just a ticket. He carried the weight of years of hard work, dedication, and the respect he had earned in the world outside that aircraft. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. The crisp boarding pass in his hand clearly stated, "First class," yet the eyes that met him did not see the words printed on it. They saw only what they wanted to see. The whispers began almost immediately, subtle at first, but unmistakable in their intention. The flight attendant's forced smile carried the thin veneer of politeness that couldn't hide the doubt lurking beneath. And then, with one dismissive gesture, they shattered his dignity. They asked him to step aside, questioned whether he belonged there, and finally, forced him to leave the seat he had rightfully claimed. The humiliation unfolded not in the shadows but under the watchful eyes of dozens of strangers. Every passenger bore silent witness, some with pity, some with indifference, and some with the smug satisfaction of seeing someone put in their place. For him, each moment of that scene cut deeper than words could. The first-class cabin wasn't just about luxury or legroom. It was a symbol of status, of accomplishment, of the miles traveled and battles fought in the journey of life and career. To be stripped of it so carelessly, so publicly, was not just an inconvenience, it was an insult to his identity. He felt the sting of judgment, not because he lacked the means to sit there, but because others couldn't reconcile his presence with their narrow perceptions of who deserved it. Humiliation in front of everyone has a way of burning itself into memory. It lingers, not just because of the action, but because of the eyes watching, the silent agreement, the lack of resistance from those who could have spoken but chose silence instead. Every step he took away from that seat felt heavier than the last. He could sense the weight of glances following him down the aisle, each one like a dagger piercing through the thin armor of composure he struggled to maintain. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as if the entire cabin was complicit in stripping him of his rightful place. No explanation he offered seemed to matter, no protest carried weight, because the decision had already been made in the minds of those who judged him the moment he walked in. He sat in his new seat, but the humiliation did not stay behind. It followed him, clung to him, replayed itself with every stolen glance from across the cabin. It wasn't just the act of being forced out that hurt, it was the public spectacle of it. The way his dignity was questioned openly, the way his presence was treated as an anomaly to be corrected, the way he became entertainment for others to quietly consume. Humiliation thrives in such moments, when the individual is isolated and the crowd chooses observation over intervention. And yet, beneath the surface, something else began to stir. Humiliation does not exist in a vacuum, it plants a seed. The deeper the wound, the stronger the seed of resolve that begins to grow. He didn't speak then, didn't argue further, didn't create a scene, because he understood something others didn't. Silence in the face of humiliation isn't always surrender. Sometimes, it is the preparation for something greater. As the plane ascended, so too did his resolve. The humiliation he endured was not something he would allow to define him, but neither would he let it go unanswered. For every eye that had watched him being cast out, there would come a day when they would see the truth. For every whisper that doubted him, there would be voices forced to acknowledge his worth. For every moment he was made to feel small, there would be a moment where he stood taller than those who had tried to reduce him. Humiliation in front of everyone is powerful, not because of the shame it inflicts, but because of the fire it ignites in those who refuse to accept it as their final chapter. The silence he carried in that moment was not weakness, it was strength disguised as stillness. When others would have raised their voice, shouted, argued, or demanded justice right then and there, he chose to sit quietly, allowing the sting of the insult to wash over him without letting it break his composure. To anyone watching, it may have seemed as though he accepted the humiliation, that he surrendered to their judgment without resistance. But inside, his silence was not surrender, it was control, the kind of control only a person with true inner strength could maintain. It takes far more power to hold one's tongue than to unleash words in anger. He knew that rage might satisfy the moment, but it would rob him of the greater victory that could only be won through patience. Every second of silence became a statement in itself. It said, without words, that he would not lower himself to the level of those who wronged him. It said that his dignity did not depend on their approval. It said that he was strong enough to absorb the blow without flinching. There is a rare kind of strength in not reacting, in refusing to give those who humiliate you the satisfaction of seeing your spirit broken. His stillness, his calm, his refusal to fight back immediately, all of it masked the storm brewing beneath the surface. And though they thought they had silenced him, the truth was he had chosen silence as his weapon, because sometimes the quietest response is the loudest reminder of strength. The silent strength he carried was built over years of trials, battles fought far away from the eyes of strangers on an airplane. It was the kind of strength that comes from overcoming rejection, from working twice as hard just to be recognized half as much, from turning every insult and every doubt into fuel. People often mistake silence for weakness, but in reality, it is the language of those who have mastered their emotions. He knew what it meant to be underestimated, he knew what it meant to walk into rooms where no one expected him to belong, and he knew the discipline it took to hold steady in moments designed to break a person down. His silence was not the absence of words, it was the presence of power, a power too vast to be wasted on petty arguments in a crowded cabin. Others sitting around him may have thought he was defeated, but they did not understand that strength is not always shown through defiance. Sometimes strength is shown in patience, in the ability to endure what others cannot. His silence was a mirror to those around him, it reflected back their own biases, their own smallness, their own cruelty. While they judged him, he judged them with his quiet composure. While they stripped him of his seat, he stripped them of their illusions of superiority by refusing to play the role of the victim. Silent strength often unsettles those who expect resistance, because it denies them the conflict they crave. Instead of a scene, they were left with a man who absorbed the humiliation without crumbling, and that unsettled them more than any argument could have. As the hours passed, that silence became heavier, stronger, more undeniable. It was the silence of someone who knew his worth and did not need to prove it to anyone in that moment. It was the silence of someone who had faced far greater trials than the pettiness of being forced from a seat. It was the silence of a man who carried within him the certainty that one day, one way or another, he would remind them of their mistake. Silent strength is patient, and patience is often mistaken for passivity. But he was not passive, he was storing energy, waiting for the right moment, the perfect moment, when his actions would speak louder than any words could. He carried himself with calm, but inside, every beat of his heart echoed with determination. Silent strength does not break, it bends, it waits, it gathers itself until it can strike with precision. And while they dismissed him, while they carried on with their routines believing they had put him in his place, he carried his silent strength like armor. It protected him from their scorn, it kept his spirit unshaken, and it reminded him of the truth, that strength is not about how loud you can be in the moment, but how deeply you can endure until the right time comes. They looked at him and saw someone ordinary, someone who could be dismissed without consequence, someone who could be treated as if his presence in first class was nothing more than a mistake. From the moment he stepped into that cabin, their assumptions worked against him. They saw only the surface, and the surface told them a story they wanted to believe. They believed he was out of place, that his confidence was arrogance, that his ticket was questionable, that his very existence in that space was temporary. In their eyes, he was the wrong man to be sitting there, but in truth, they had chosen the wrong man to underestimate. Underestimation is a dangerous miscalculation. It blinds people to reality and makes them act recklessly, assuming they hold all the power. The flight attendants who questioned him, the passengers who stared with suspicion, the individuals who decided he was less deserving, they all shared in that same mistake. They thought that removing him from first class would be the end of the story. They thought his silence meant surrender. They thought he was someone who would carry that humiliation quietly, return home, and accept it as another injustice in a world already full of them. But what they failed to see was the depth of his strength, the years of discipline, the power of resilience, and the authority that did not need to be shouted to be real. They underestimated his patience, not realizing that patience is a form of power. They underestimated his silence, not realizing that silence is often the mask worn by those who know their time will come. They underestimated his worth, not realizing that worth does not require validation from others. They underestimated his influence, not realizing that the man they pushed aside had the ability to command entire boardrooms, lead thousands, and make decisions that rippled far beyond the walls of an airplane. They saw only a man sitting in a seat, but the reality was far larger than what their prejudiced eyes could comprehend. The wrong man had been chosen because he was not just any passenger. He was not powerless, and he was not forgettable. He was a man whose life had been built on overcoming doubt, whose victories had been forged in the fires of rejection, and whose rise had been fueled by being underestimated again and again. Each time he was doubted, he had turned that doubt into motivation. Each time he was dismissed, he had turned dismissal into triumph. Being underestimated was nothing new to him, it was the pattern of his life. And once again, he found himself in a familiar position, facing people who thought they could reduce him, unaware that they were only setting the stage for their own regret. There is a unique kind of confidence that comes from knowing people misjudge you. It allows you to walk calmly into rooms where others doubt you, it allows you to endure slights without retaliation, and it allows you to wait until the moment when truth can no longer be ignored. He carried that confidence as he sat in his new seat, even while others believed they had stripped him of dignity. They had not stripped him of anything. In reality, they had handed him something invaluable, the opportunity to prove them wrong in a way so undeniable that they would never forget it. To underestimate someone like him was to play with fire while believing it was only smoke. Those who forced him out of his seat believed the matter was closed. They failed to consider that the man they had shamed was one who did not carry wounds quietly. They failed to consider that the humiliation they inflicted was a debt that would one day be repaid with interest. They failed to consider that he was not the type to fade into the background, but the type whose very presence had power, even if they were too blind to see it. They underestimated his story, the miles he had traveled, the sacrifices he had made, the battles he had won long before stepping onto that plane. They underestimated his ability to endure, not realizing that endurance is a weapon in itself. They underestimated his pride, thinking it was fragile enough to be broken by a seat on an airplane, when in reality it was unshakable, built on years of proving himself in places where the odds had been stacked against him. They underestimated his resolve, not knowing that every slight against him only strengthened his will to rise higher. The wrong man had been underestimated, and that was the mistake that would transform the entire situation. For when someone like him is underestimated, they do not break, they do not disappear, and they do not forget. Instead, they wait, they prepare, and they strike when the moment is right, turning every act of disrespect into fuel for a revenge that is not loud, but undeniable, not petty, but unforgettable, not immediate, but lasting in a way that changes everything for those who believed he was less than who he truly was. Power is most effective when it is revealed at the perfect moment. For much of that flight, he sat in silence, carrying himself with an unshakable calm that confused those who thought they had defeated him. They assumed the matter was settled, that by forcing him out of first class they had closed the chapter and moved on. But what they did not know was that he held a kind of authority that did not need to be shouted in anger or proven in haste. True power often waits, it measures the situation, it observes, and then it strikes with precision so sharp it leaves no room for doubt. He understood this principle deeply, and so he allowed the hours to pass, each one bringing him closer to the moment when he would remind them of exactly who he was. When the plane landed and passengers began to gather their belongings, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity, offering no hint of the revelation that was coming. The attendants still moved about with an air of self-importance, passengers still glanced at him with a lingering sense of superiority, and the sting of humiliation still hung in the air. Yet, beneath the surface, he was in complete control. For men like him, revenge does not come in shouts and arguments, it comes in the unveiling of truth at a time when it cannot be ignored. He waited for the moment when eyes would turn toward him not with suspicion, but with awe. That is the power of timing, it transforms silence into a weapon and patience into dominance. Revealing power at the perfect moment requires discipline. Anyone can lash out when they are hurt, anyone can argue when they are wronged, but it takes a rare kind of strength to hold it in, to wait, to choose not the immediate satisfaction but the lasting victory. He was a master of that discipline. In that cabin, he had already mapped out the outcome in his mind. He knew that the humiliation he had endured was temporary, but the impact of revealing his true status at the right time would echo far beyond that flight. He did not need to defend himself in the heat of the moment, because he knew his authority would speak louder when the world least expected it. Power revealed too early is wasted, but power revealed at the perfect time reshapes perceptions permanently. He had lived his life navigating spaces where people doubted him, and he had learned the art of letting them underestimate him. He knew the shock that would follow when their assumptions collided with reality, when the man they dismissed turned out to hold more influence than they could ever imagine. That was the stage he was setting with his silence, the stage for a revelation so undeniable it would turn humiliation into regret, and arrogance into shame. For the attendants, their power was temporary. It lasted only as long as the flight, only as long as the uniform gave them authority in that narrow space. But his power extended far beyond those aisles and seats. His influence reached into boardrooms, across industries, and into decisions that shaped futures. That was the difference between borrowed power and earned power. They wielded theirs recklessly, unaware that his was greater, deeper, and waiting for the right moment to surface. When true power is revealed, it exposes the fragility of false authority, and nothing unsettles people more than realizing they judged the wrong person. The perfect moment is often when arrogance is at its peak, when those who think they hold control are most confident in their victory. He recognized that moment with clarity. By letting them believe they had won, by letting them savor the illusion of control, he only magnified the impact of his eventual revelation. When truth comes crashing down at the height of arrogance, it does not simply correct, it humiliates, it dismantles, it forces a reckoning. That is why he waited, because the fall is always harder when pride has climbed too high. As the passengers disembarked, the chance arrived for his true identity to come forward. A simple introduction, a casual interaction, a moment in which his position and influence were laid bare was enough to shatter the assumptions that had governed their actions. Suddenly, the man they thought did not belong became the man who belonged more than any of them. Their faces shifted, their voices faltered, their confidence crumbled in the face of a reality they had never considered. That is the devastating beauty of revealing power at the perfect moment. It does not need to be exaggerated or forced, it speaks for itself, and it leaves an imprint that no apology can erase. He had endured humiliation in silence, but silence was never his weakness. It was the pause before the revelation, the space in which his strength gathered itself, the calm before the storm that would upend everything. Power revealed at the wrong time is noise. Power revealed at the right time is thunder. And when that thunder echoed, it was impossible for anyone on that flight to forget who he was, what he represented, and the lesson they had unwillingly written for themselves through their own arrogance. Turning humiliation into revenge is an art that not everyone can master. Many people, when faced with embarrassment in front of others, either crumble under its weight or lash out in anger, desperate to reclaim what was taken from them. But for him, humiliation was never the end, it was the beginning. What others saw as a final insult, he saw as raw material, fuel that could be transformed into something greater. When he was forced out of that seat, when every pair of eyes silently agreed with the decision, when the weight of judgment pressed down on him, he did not allow the humiliation to settle as defeat. Instead, he absorbed it, carried it within him, and began shaping it into the very force that would drive his revenge. Humiliation, in its cruelest form, tries to strip a person of dignity. It attempts to remind them of their supposed place, to reduce them to a shadow of themselves in the eyes of others. Yet for people like him, who have lived their lives proving doubters wrong, humiliation does not strip away dignity, it sharpens it. The sting of that moment became etched into his mind, not as a scar, but as a map, guiding him toward the precise way he would reclaim what was his. Revenge was not about shouting back or demanding recognition in that moment. Revenge was about patience, about timing, about waiting until the perfect opportunity arose to turn shame into triumph. The humiliation he endured did not vanish when he sat in his new seat. It lingered, replaying itself in the back of his mind. But with each replay, he did not feel weaker, he felt stronger. He thought about the arrogance of those who judged him, about the confidence with which they stripped him of his place, and about the smirks of those who assumed the matter was finished. Every detail of the scene hardened his resolve. He was not going to let this fade away into another forgotten injustice. He was going to use it, bend it, and shape it into the kind of revenge that would not only heal his pride but also teach them a lesson they would carry with them forever. Revenge, for him, was never about anger, it was about justice. He knew that words spoken in the heat of the moment would be forgotten, that arguments would only make him look desperate. But actions, carefully chosen and perfectly timed, would speak louder than any defense he could offer. And so he allowed humiliation to transform into strategy. He envisioned the look on their faces when they discovered the truth, the shift in their voices when they realized who he truly was, the discomfort that would eat away at them when they understood the gravity of their mistake. That was the revenge he sought, not noise, but silence, not confrontation, but revelation. Every ounce of humiliation became a drop of fuel, and together they built a fire that burned steadily within him. He carried himself with quiet grace, never letting on that beneath that composure lived a determination as sharp as steel. His revenge would not be rushed, because true revenge is never rushed. It is measured, precise, and delivered with such clarity that it cannot be undone. He was willing to wait, because he knew the longer he waited, the more powerful the moment of reversal would be. And when that moment arrived, it would not just restore what had been taken from him, it would elevate him, reminding everyone that their attempt to diminish him had only amplified his strength. The beauty of turning humiliation into revenge is that it flips the script completely. What was once a moment of weakness becomes the foundation of power. What was once a source of pain becomes a tool of victory. That is exactly what he prepared for, and that is why he endured quietly. The humiliation did not break him, it gave him direction. The revenge he planned was not for himself alone, but for the lesson it would teach. It was for every eye that watched without speaking, for every whisper that doubted, for every assumption that fueled the insult. His revenge would make them see themselves, force them to confront their own arrogance, and remind them that no one should ever be underestimated. By the time the opportunity came, he was ready. The humiliation that had once been heavy now felt like a weapon sharpened by time. He did not need to raise his voice, he did not need to boast, he did not need to demand an apology. His revenge unfolded naturally, as if the universe itself had conspired to give him the chance to balance the scales. And when it did, the same eyes that had watched his humiliation now watched his triumph. The same whispers that had questioned him now turned into stunned silence. The same people who thought they had reduced him were now forced to reckon with the truth, that their cruelty had only written the script for their own downfall. A lesson they would never forget was not written in his words but in his actions, in the calm way he carried himself after being humiliated, in the unshakable strength he revealed when the truth could no longer be hidden. Lessons that last a lifetime do not come from lectures or explanations, they come from moments that cut so deeply into memory that they cannot be erased. For those who thought they could strip him of his dignity, the realization of who he truly was arrived like a sudden storm, unexpected and impossible to ignore. It was not the kind of lesson that fades with time, it was the kind that burns itself into the conscience, returning again and again whenever arrogance dares to rise. The lesson began the moment they saw the contrast between how they treated him and who he actually was. In their eyes, he had been nothing more than a man out of place, a mistake in their orderly world of assumptions. They believed they had corrected that mistake by forcing him out of first class, by reminding him of the invisible line they thought he had crossed. But the moment his identity surfaced, the moment they realized the scope of his influence and the magnitude of his success, the air shifted. What had seemed like authority in the hands of a few attendants dissolved instantly, and what had seemed like superiority in the eyes of onlookers collapsed into shame. That shift was the lesson: never assume, never judge, never mistake the surface for the truth. What made the lesson unforgettable was not simply the revelation of his status, but the timing of it. If he had fought back in the heat of the moment, if he had shouted or demanded recognition, the lesson would have been lost in the noise. They would have dismissed him as emotional, unreasonable, combative. But because he waited, because he chose silence, because he allowed them to display their arrogance without interruption, the truth landed with a weight they could not escape. The memory of their own behavior now stood side by side with the reality of who they had disrespected, and together they formed a lesson that was seared into their pride. Every passenger who watched, every attendant who acted, carried that memory with them. Some felt guilt, some felt shame, and some felt anger at themselves for joining in the silent complicity. Regardless of their role, they all walked away with the same truth pressing heavily on their minds: they had underestimated the wrong man. That truth did not dissolve when the plane emptied, it followed them home, it echoed in their thoughts, it lingered in conversations they would later have. It was not just a story of one man's humiliation, it was a mirror held up to their own prejudices. That is why it was unforgettable, because it was not just his victory, it was their exposure. The lesson was also about power, about the difference between temporary authority and lasting influence. Those attendants held power only within the narrow confines of that aircraft, power lent to them by a uniform and a role. But his power extended beyond that space, beyond that flight, into places they could not reach. Their authority had humiliated him in a moment, but his influence had the strength to humble them for a lifetime. The collision of those two forms of power revealed a truth that could not be ignored: arrogance built on shallow authority always crumbles when confronted with genuine greatness. That is why they would never forget, because the memory of their arrogance was tied directly to the revelation of his true stature. There is something unforgettable about being caught in the act of underestimating someone. It is not just the embarrassment of being wrong, it is the weight of knowing you exposed your own prejudice to the world. The passengers who stared, the attendants who acted, they could not hide behind excuses once the truth was revealed. They had made their choices publicly, they had sided with humiliation, they had played a part in reinforcing an insult. And now, with the truth before them, they had to live with that knowledge. That is why the lesson burned so deeply. It was not abstract, it was personal. It showed them who they really were in that moment, and it forced them to face it. The lesson he delivered without a single word would live on in them far longer than any confrontation could have. They had expected weakness, but they witnessed strength. They had expected surrender, but they saw patience. They had expected silence to mean defeat, but they discovered silence can be the most powerful weapon of all. And when the revelation came, when the truth shattered their assumptions, they realized they had been participants in their own downfall. That realization does not fade easily, it lingers, it returns, it replays itself over and over whenever pride tempts them to judge another so quickly again. What made the lesson unforgettable was not only its impact on them but the way it redefined the entire story. It was no longer a tale of a man forced out of a seat, it was a story of arrogance humbled, of prejudice exposed, of quiet strength triumphing over public humiliation. That kind of story stays with people, reshaping how they think, how they act, how they view the world. And for those who had wronged him, it became a lesson engraved in memory, a reminder of the moment they tried to diminish someone who stood taller than they could have ever imagined.